Okay, so now that we know about muscle contraction, we're going to go a little bit deeper into that and talk about different kinds of contractions and how our muscles use energy. So we are going to start with the length-tension relationship. This is the amount of tension generated by a muscle and the force of contraction, which depends on how stretched or contracted it was before it was stimulated. If a muscle is overly contracted at rest, a weak contraction will result. And this is because the thick filaments are too close to the Z discs and therefore can't slide. If a muscle is too stretched before stimulated, a weak contraction will result. This is because there's little overlap of thin and thick filaments, and it does not allow for very many cross bridges to form. The optimum resting length produces the greatest force when a muscle contracts. This has to deal with muscle tone. Your central nervous system continually monitors and adjusts the length of the resting muscle, and it maintains a state of partially contraction, which is called muscle tone. It maintains an optimal length and makes the muscles ideal and ready for action. So, there are some phases of a twitch contraction. First, you have what's called a latent period. This is a 2 millisecond delay between the onset of the stimulus and the onset of the twitch response. This is the time required for excitation, the excitation-contraction coupling, and the tensing of the elastic components of the muscle. It is an internal tension, and it is a force generated during the latent period and where no shortening of a muscle will occur. You then have the contraction phase. This is the phase in which the filaments slide and the muscle shortens. Once elastic components are taut, the muscle begins to produce external tension. This moves as a load, and it is a short-lived phase. We then have the relaxation phase, and this is where the SR will quickly reabsorb that calcium, and the myosin will release the thin filaments and the tension will decline. This is where the muscle returns to the resting length. So the entire twitch will last about 7 to 100 milliseconds. So there are different contraction strengths. At a sub-threshold stimulus, no contraction will occur. So threshold, if something is meeting the threshold strength or it is above, you will see a twitch produced. So twitches are caused by an increase in voltage and are no stronger than those at a threshold. So it's not entirely true that a muscle fiber will obey an all-in-one law, contracting to its maximum or not at all. When we have electrical excitation of a muscle, it will follow an all or none. But that is not true that muscle fibers follow the all or none law. So twitches will vary in length and strength depending upon these things. The stimulus frequency, which is the stimuli arriving closer together to produce stronger twitches, the concentration of the calcium in the sarcoplasm, which can help vary the frequency, how stretched the muscle was before it was stimulated, the temperature of the muscle, meaning was it warmed up, because warmed up muscles will contract more strongly because the enzymes are working more quickly. A lower than a normal pH in the sarcoplasm will weaken a contraction and cause fatigue. And hydration of muscles can affect the overlapping of the thin and thick filaments. Muscles need to be able to contract with variable strengths for different tasks, right? Not all the things you do are the same within your body. So there is recruitment and stimulus intensity. Stimulating the nerve with higher and higher voltages will produce a stronger contraction. Higher voltages excite more and more nerve fibers in the motor nerve, which will stimulate more and more motor units to contract. Recruitment, or what's called multiple motor unit summation, MMU, is the process of bringing more motor units into play. When a stimulus intensity remains constant, the twitch strength can vary with the stimulus frequency. Up to 10 stimuli per second. Each stimulus will produce identical twitches and full recovery between these twitches. That is the first picture. Then you have what's called a trep or a staircase phenomenon, where it's building, where the twitches are building on themselves. So here the muscle still recovers fully between the twitches, but each twitch develops more tension than the one before. And the stimuli are arriving so rapidly that the SR does not have the time between the stimuli to completely reabsorb all the calcium it has released. So the calcium concentration in the cytosol rises higher and higher, and each stimulus causes subsequent twitches to be stronger. Heat released by each twitch can cause muscle enzymes such as myosin ATPase to work more efficiently and produce stronger twitches as the muscle warms up. There is also what's called incomplete and complete tetanus. Incomplete tetanus we usually see with a 20 to 40 stimuli per second, and this means that each new stimulus arrives before the previous twitch is over. The new twitch rides or piggybacks on the previous one, generating a higher tension. Temporal summation results when two stimuli arrive close together. Wave summation results when one wave or contraction is added to another. Each twitch reaches a higher level of tension than the one before. And the muscle only relaxes partially between the stimuli. This produces a state of sustained fluttering contraction called incomplete tetanus. Complete tetanus we see when you have 40 to 50 stimuli per second. Here the muscle has no time to relax at all before the next stimulus arrives. So the twitches fuse into a smooth, prolonged contraction that we call complete tetanus. A muscle is in complete tetanus. When it will produce about 4 times the tension of a single twitch. This rarely occurs in the body, and it rarely we rarely see more than 25 stimuli per second. The smoothness of muscle contractions is because the motor units function asynchronously. When one motor unit relaxes, another contracts and takes over so the muscle does not lose tension. There are also different types of contractions in the sense of what your muscle is doing. So we have isometric and isotonic contractions. An isometric muscle contraction is when we see a muscle is producing internal tension while an external resistance causes it to stay the same length or become longer. This can be a prelude to movement when tension is absorbed by elastic components of muscle. It is important in postural muscle function and antagonistic muscle joint stabilization. So the muscle is developing tension, but it is not shortening. You also have isotonic muscle contraction. This means that the muscle changes in length with no change in tension. Concentric contraction means the muscle shortens while maintaining tension, and eccentric contraction means the muscle is lengthening as it is maintaining tension. At the beginning of a contraction of an isometric phase, the muscle tension rises, but the muscle does not shorten. When tension overcomes the resistance of the load, the tension levels off. The muscle begins to shorten and move the load. This is the isotonic phase. How do our muscles obtain energy? Well, all muscle contraction, we already know, depends on ATP. ATP supply depends on oxygen and basically what we eat. Energy sources such as glucose and fatty acids. There are two main pathways of ATP synthesis. There is anaerobic fermentation and aerobic respiration. Anaerobic fermentation basically enables cells to produce ATP in the absence of oxygen. This yields very little ATP, and also there is a buildup of toxic lactic acid, and this is why muscles can fatigue. This could be if you get a cramp. Sometimes we get that weird side cramp. That is usually due to a lactic acid buildup in your muscle. And it is happening because maybe you are breathing irregularly and you are not taking in enough oxygen to kick your body over into aerobic respiration. So you are building up this lactic acid in your muscle and it is hurting. The minute you start breathing regularly again and your body kicks over into aerobic respiration, the lactic acid will dissipate and you will probably no longer feel that cramp. Aerobic respiration produces far more ATP than anaerobic. It has less toxic end products because it actually produces CO2 and water, and it requires a continual supply of oxygen, hence the name. So, depending on what you are doing, your muscles may need different types of energy needs. When we have immediate energy needs, this would be something where you'd have like a short, intense exercise, perhaps a 100-meter dash. Oxygen is needed briefly, and if it is, it can be supplied by the myoglobin for a limited amount of aerobic respiration, but it is rapidly depleted. Muscles meet most of the ATP demand by borrowing phosphate groups, that P, from other molecules and transferring them to ADP, making ATP. Remember, DP is diphosphate, TP is triphosphate. And it's the pulling off of that third P that gives us the burst of energy. So two enzyme systems control these phosphate transfers. Myokinase transfers P from one ADP to another, converting the latter to ATP. And we also have creatine kinase, which obtains P from a phosphate storage molecule, creatine phosphate. Fast-acting systems that help, these are both fast-acting systems that help maintain the ATP level while other ATP generating mechanisms are being activated. You have a phosphagen system, the ATP and the CP collectively. We just talked about those. These provide nearly all the energy used for short bursts of intense activity. Maybe something like a quick, brisk walk, or if you need to sprint or swim fast. And these are important in activities that require these quick, maximum efforts. Maybe like football or baseball or weightlifting. These are things that cannot be sustained for long amounts of time normally. Then we have short-term energy needs. And these we need as we exhaust that phosphagen system. So now our muscles are shifting to anaerobic fermentation. This means that the muscles obtain glucose from the blood and their own stored glycogen. In the absence of oxygen, glycolysis can generate a net gain of 2 ATPs for every glucose molecule consumed. But it also converts this glucose to lactic acid. The glycogen lactic acid system is the pathway from glycogen to lactic acid. And this will only produce enough ATP for about 30 to 40 seconds of maximum activity. Again, not sustainable. So for long-term energy needs, after 40 seconds or so, our respiratory and our cardiovascular systems catch up, meaning they are now delivering the oxygen to the muscles fast enough for aerobic respiration to meet our ATP demands. Aerobic respiration can produce 36 ATP per glucose. Much more efficient. So this is the efficient means of prolonged exercise, how we're going to get all those ATPs. And once your body, again, catches up, you can sustain this. This is how you're able to do physical activity for long amounts of time. Now, you do lose things. Depletion of glycogen and blood glucose, together with the loss of fluid and electrolytes through sweating, can set limits on endurance and performance, even when lactic acid isn't the main player. So you can only go so long unless you are highly conditioned. Because you get fatigued. Muscle fatigue is the progressive weakness and loss of contractility from prolonged use of muscles. You know your muscles get fatigued, they get sore. It can be for any number of reasons. But the causes of muscle fatigue is that the ATP synthesis declines as glycogen is consumed. And this ATP shortage will slow down the sodium-potassium pumps. This compromises their ability to maintain the resting membrane potential and the excitability of the muscle fibers. Lactic acid will lower the pH of the sarcoplasm. This inhibits the enzymes involved in contraction, ATP synthesis, and other aspects of muscle function. The release of potassium with each action potential causes the accumulation of extracellular potassium. This hyperpolarizes the cell and makes the muscle fiber less excitable. Motor nerve fibers use up their acetylcholine. Therefore, they are less capable of stimulating muscle fibers, which will cause a junctional fatigue. Your central nervous system, where all motor commands originate, fatigues by unknown processes. So there is less signal output to the skeletal muscles. Endurance. This is the ability to maintain high-intensity exercise for more than 4 to 5 minutes. This is something you have to build up. It is determined in large by one's maximum oxygen uptake. This is the point at which the rate of oxygen consumption reaches a plateau and does not increase further with an added workload. It is proportional to one's body size. It usually peaks around 20 years old, and it is usually greater in males than females. But it can be twice as great in trained endurance athletes as in an untrained person, and this results in twice of the ATP production. Meaning, if you want to go run a marathon, you need to train for it. You need to train your body to be able to take as much oxygen in as possible and to get your systems working so that you can create as much ATP as possible to fuel your muscles. And this takes time, right? You don't just go out and run a marathon. It takes a lot of training, and it's this endurance training that allows your body to be more efficient and more functional, and then be able to sustain this type of activity for long periods of time. Oxygen debt. If you do something strenuous, you may have some heavy breathing. This is referred to as excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. This is the difference between the resting rate of oxygen consumption and the elevated rate following exercise. And this has to do with repaying the oxygen debt, right? Sometimes you're panting as you stop exercising. It is needed for the following purposes. It replaces oxygen reserves depleted in the first minute of exercise. Oxygen is bound to myoglobin and blood hemoglobin, and oxygen is dissolved in the blood plasma and other extracellular fluid. And there is oxygen in the air in the lungs. You have to replenish the phosphagen system. This is the synthesizing of ATP and using some of it to donate the phosphate groups back to creatine until the resting levels of ATP and CP are restored. It deals with oxidizing lactic acid. 80% of the lactic acid produced by muscles enters the bloodstream. It is reconverted to pyruvic acid in the kidneys, the cardiac muscle, and the liver. The liver converts most of the pyruvic acid back to glucose to replenish the glycogen stores of the muscle. And then we have serving the elevated metabolic rate. This occurs when the body temperature remains elevated by exercise and therefore consumes more oxygen. How do you beat muscle fatigue? Well, you can take oral creatine, which will increase the level of creatine phosphate in muscle tissue and increase the speed of ATP regeneration. This is useful in burst types of exercises like weightlifting. But the risks are not well known. Sometimes you can have muscle cramping, electrolyte imbalances, dehydration, water retention, or stroke. You could also have kidney problems due to overloading the kidneys with metabolic creatinine. Carbohydrate loading, meaning you could eat a lot of extra carbohydrates. This will pack extra glycogen into your muscle cells. Sometimes going back to the running, before a big run, many people eat a lot of carbohydrates, and this is for a quick energy source when you are doing extensive exercise for a long period of time. Physiological classes of muscle fibers. We have slow oxidative, slow twitch, red, or type 1 fibers. These have abundant mitochondria, myoglobin, and capillaries. They are deep red color. They are adapted for aerobic respiration, and they fatigue resistance. They are relative in long twitch lasting about 100 milliseconds. They are found in the soleus of the calf and the postural muscles of the back. You also have fast twitch, or what we call white or type 2 fibers. These are fibers that are well adapted for quick responses, but not for fatigue resistance. They are rich in enzymes such as phosphagen and glycogen lactic acid systems, and they generate lactic acid, which does cause fatigue. They are poor in mitochondria, myoglobin, and blood capillaries, which gives them pale appearance, hence the white. We see these in the eye muscles, the gastrocnemius, and the biceps bronchi. The ratio of different fiber types have genetic predisposition. So maybe you were lucky enough to be a born sprinter. So the muscles differ in fiber types. And it can have to do with your genetics. Strength and conditioning. Muscles can generate more tension than the bones and tendons can withstand. So, muscle strength depends on primarily the muscle size, the fascicle arrangement, the size of motor units, the motor unit summation, temporal summation, the length-tension relationship, and fatigue. All these things play a role in how your muscles are going to respond and how strong they are and how conditioned they are, and your endurance level for that matter. So when we have something like resistance training, which an example would be weightlifting, we see a contraction of a muscle against a load that resists movement. A few minutes of resistant exercise a few times a week is enough to stimulate muscle growth. And the growth is from cellular enlargement. Muscle fibers will synthesize more myofilaments, and myofibrils will then grow thicker. Then there is endurance training or aerobic exercise. This improves fatigue resistant muscles because the slow twitch fibers produce more mitochondria, glycogen, and acquire a greater density of blood capillaries. This will improve the skeletal strength. It increases the red blood count cell and oxygen transport capacity of the blood, meaning it will enhance the function of the cardiovascular, respiratory, and nervous systems. And that brings us to the close of our lecture. I hope you learned something and enjoyed yourself. Take care.